Okay, we're going to have a time of question and answer now, and we will welcome questions from the floor. Now, the difficulty is obviously two roving mics we actually have, so I may hand this one over to Esther, or we'll see if we can get another one. Oh, you can have another one. There's a red one over there that's coming. But you may want to put a question specifically to Tanya concerning her message or anything that we've had during the course of the day. Someone has written in a question already, so why don't we just stay with this. It says here, early in his talk, John Lennox referred to the problem of doubt, doubts which were particular to those with mental health problems. Do you have any further advice for Christians who struggle to find the confidence to engage with others due to anxiety and depression? I think maybe... First of all, to say that I think that there are a lot of things that Christians don't seem very happy to talk about. Doubt is one of those issues that a lot of Christians seem very comfortable talking about, and depression seems sadly to be another issue that a lot of Christians don't feel happy or confident talking about. So I think what we would generally say would be, first of all, it's very important that you do find someone who you can talk to who really does, especially if it is a mental health issue, someone who actually understands these issues properly, deeply, and so on, is actually qualified. Now, I don't think he's looking for referrals. I have a very good friend called Tom Smiley, and I just think Smiley is the perfect surname for a man involved in clinical psychiatry. And he did his 6 years of clinical psychiatry up here, actually at Oxford, and he's now actually a consultant within the NHS and works also alongside Labrie. And very often, he is someone who I would turn to if someone comes to me with an issue that I don't understand. I'd ring up and say, look, I want to understand where this person's coming from. They're asking me these questions. Can I refer them on to you, or can you explain something to me, that I might be able to give to them to be of help? So first thing I would say is there are actual Christians out there, people who love Christ, who can actually speak about these things with a lot of degree of authority and expertise. Find someone. The second thing I would say is being part of a praying community in this situation is very important. And I would encourage you to try to find part of a community where you may be able to share something of what you're going through. It may not necessarily be possible for you to share all of it because of the anxiety you have in and of itself, or it may be that the scale of the problems are such that that if you went into a lot of detail, that other people just not sure exactly know what to do with it. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that you can't do anything. Does that make sense? To be part of a community where you can have share of something and know some level of support will be exceedingly helpful. Now, I'm not sure who wrote the question, but if you're writing this either because of a personal issue that you're in or because you have someone who's very close to you, I would be more than happy to refer you on to a group of people who I'm often in touch with myself. When I'm looking for advice and guidance on these issues and for people to help me. One last thing I would do is, I know it's unusual normally for one Christian organisation to plug another, but I actually think that Labrie is a remarkable institution precisely for this reason. Labrie, if you're not familiar with it, was set up by a guy called Francis Schaeffer, who was a prolific author and speaker, and had a very profound impact in the life of the church, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Indeed, I would say some of his writings were really quite prophetic, in the sense when you read them in the time that he wrote them and you think about the situations we're in now, it's very interesting how much outworking is actually there of what he said would happen has actually happened. But Labrie is a residential centre. They organise lectures in apologetics, they teach in apologetics, they train in apologetics, and they all live together in a big house. I was going to say a big drafty house, but I understand they've installed some new wood-burning stoves, even this last summer, which means the average temperature inside is now slightly above 3 degrees centigrade, which is a vast improvement on where it used to be. And there are very open and frank discussions that take in a whole range of subjects, including this. And the doors are open to all and sundry, atheists, agnostics, people of other religions, Christians who have doubts and issues, those who just simply want to go to learn, and they all find themselves in this place. And it is a tremendous, it can be a tremendous resource. And it may be, for some of you, if you are in a stage where you think there are a whole bunch of issues that have built up over time, and you're wondering where you can go with them, who you can talk them about with, that will actually take them take what you have to say seriously and intelligently, and actually try to go from there, then I would strongly recommend having a look to see whether something like that could be of help. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else, but why don't we just see if there are any other questions out there?
Thank you very much for a really inspiring day. How can we have more courage, and how do you guys kind of keep your courage levels up?
I don't know why this is coming back to me. I think both Tanya and Amy should speak to this too. I think, hopefully, part of the answer is partly one of the reasons why we like to do days like this is our hope is not that we want a group of people to talk to, but that we're looking to be part of a movement of a church that rises up and actually says, yes, to Christ. Yes, we can go. We can do this. We will lay down our lives. Send me. And so I think the answer is one of the reasons why church is so important, why church is so central, and why all of us who are part of this ministry all are, told and deliberately make church an active part of life. Is we all need a community around us too, that we're worshipping with, that we're part of, that encourages us when we need encouragement, that we can share with when we need to share. And so I think that's very important, to maintain. I think that would say that's all where it comes from. On the courage side, I think, without being overly dramatic, I think it's something that you're often only given in the situation you're in. It's very hard to have courage, I found, in abstract.
Yeah.
So there are countries I go to, and I can remember talking with someone who he was talking about going to Saudi Arabia, and he was saying, well, if I ever found I had a terminal illness, I'd go to Saudi and tell everyone I knew about Jesus. And I can remember thinking, what you're basically telling me is the only reason you'd ever go to that country is if it would cost you nothing. In other words, if you already knew you were dead, then you would go. But in a very real biblical sense, we are already dead. And so why not go? I spent my childhood in Saudi Arabia, so there's more of us go. So I think, first of all, you actually have to step out to. So that's the next thing I'd encourage. And I think the last thing is to say is that you can't have an overly romantic view of this. I know I've been in situations where I've arrived in countries and thought, oh help, why am I here? I can remember being in one country, and I checked into my hotel room, and I can remember feeling overwhelmed with fear and just praying, just for the strength to do what I needed to do, and knowing the group that I was going to go and speak to. And you can. I've known fear in those times. I've asked myself questions like, will I ever get home from this? But also in that same moment, of crying out to God, saying, well, I really believe you brought me here, so help me. You suddenly find yourself speaking and talking in a way that just really is very surprising. And I can remember very often the person who's most surprised at the end of some of these meetings when I speak in that setting and people become Christians is me. So I think that there has to be, as I say, I don't think you can know courage in abstract. I think you need a community of people around you. You need to know there are people who are praying for you. You need to know there will be times where you'll find yourself where you feel all courage has left you completely. And that's when, even in those moments, it's important to remember who we're travelling with and on whose ambassador we are. What kingdom is actually behind us. And to stand up and speak. I mean, there is a fleshly side that is fearful. I can remember speaking to a group of American military commandos, and they were interested to hear what I was going to say because we've been to some countries, same countries, but travelling on different tickets and for different purposes. Their job largely to decrease a certain proportion of the population, and my job being largely to increase the kingdom of God by whatever means are necessary. But I can remember saying to them, look, if I ever get into trouble, it would be nice if you came and got me. So there's not like a complete, abandonment of all hope at all. But it's just thinking we need to be able to step out. For some people, the biggest fear could be maybe in their workplace or with family. I can remember just after becoming a Christian and starting to work with Ravi Zacharias, my wife and I arrived in Cyprus for the first Christmas family party. My family, I have a large extended family. And, we walked into one of my uncle's houses. There were probably about 150 people there. We were the last people to arrive. And then my aunt, in a very loud voice, says, "Oh, this is Michael and Anne. Michael's recently become a Christian and is working for some small American cult in Oxford." Yeah, and everyone just turned, and I was just thinking, oh, yeah. And there've just been things that have been hard, but I think that's where we need, courage and where we need grace, and maybe we need to step out more.
I would add to that I feel fear all the time. Whether it's travelling to a dangerous country to speak, or even speaking to a mum at the school gate, you feel this fear rising in you to stop you speaking about Jesus, even when the opportunities are there. I really identify with that. And I wonder whether that's why the Bible is full of the command, do not be afraid. And we need to encourage one another by being honest, I think, praying for one another, as Michael said, in community. I tell you, in my own life, though, I think the two most important factors in embracing courage and choosing courage and not fear, I, by all means, do not succeed all the time, but where that process has happened, I think the two things that have helped me most, number one, is reading the history of the great Christian leaders of the past, not just from the Bible, obviously the Bible, but reading the biographies of men and women who have preached the gospel and seen the kingdom come. People like Hudson Taylor, Lilias Trotter, Amy Carmichael, John and Betty Stam. In my parents' church when I was growing up, an old lady came to me when I was 16 years old and gave me the biography of a missionary couple called John and Betty Stam, who were martyred in the Boxer Revolution in China. Reading that book changed my life. I can honestly say that, because I was so drawn to these people who were in their 20s and who loved Jesus so much that they were prepared to die, even when they had a small baby who was actually rescued. And had that incredible conviction in how God was with them. So that would be the first thing, the stories. And I think we're more influenced by what we read and watch than we like to believe. So if we read about celebrities in magazines constantly, and we soak our mind in that, then the mentality of that worldview will shape how we see ourselves, our family, what our aspirations are. If we read stories of great Christian heroes, many of whom the world doesn't know their name, the church doesn't even know their name, but their stories are stories of courage and valour, it's just so encouraging. I'm trying to do that with my children as well. And then I think the second thing is exposure to the suffering church is wonderful. Again, my parents were very much into supporting and us as children praying for Christians who were suffering all over the world. And we used to, through Open Doors and other organisations, pray for people in closed countries. I recently met, actually at Lausanne 3 months ago, met someone that we had prayed for in Albania for years and years and years. And I'd met him when I was 17 at an Open Doors conference where I was there with my mum and dad, and he remembered, this is, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago, 17 years ago. And it was just so encouraging to meet someone who has suffered for their faith and to hear their stories of God's faithfulness. Chinese church, similarly. So not to live in the West in our little churches and to forget the global church, but to be encouraged by their testimony and their faithfulness. And their testimony is, even when it hurts, even when I'm beaten, even when I'm in prison, Jesus is there with me, and Jesus gives me the strength to endure that. I met a woman, a Chinese church leader, who'd experienced absolutely unmentionable, horrific suffering. She was so full of joy. I said to her, if that happened to me, I'm sure I would deny Christ. She said, I used to think that, but in that situation, Jesus was with me. She said, I can't describe it other than that. So as I speak to my intimidating friend at the school gate who, is angry that my son has told her that told her son that he needs to believe in Jesus to go to heaven. As I was sort of confronting that, I remember that woman, and I remember that Jesus was with her in a much worse situation. Jesus is with me, and the Bible says, fear not. So it's not that we don't feel fear, we do. Yes, I think those are the two things that encourage me.
I think for me, probably the biggest thing has been what Michael was talking about in terms of there is no courage in the abstract. I think particularly from a persecuted church background, I used to spend a lot of time worried about persecution. Would I be able to stand it? What would my response be? And I was really comforted by, actually it's a C.S. Lewis book, Screwtape Letters, where the point is basically that God gives us grace in season and not beforehand. And so we spend a lot of time worrying that we don't have grace now for that thing then. But actually, in the moment, God gives grace. But obviously, in our day-to-day life, I think few of us are really afraid of any huge persecution. Actually, what we're afraid of is humiliation or, that kind of thing. And we're all there. That's not it's not that some people are immune from that. And for me, I guess the most helpful thing that I've found to kind of counter that, when I'm aware of it in myself, when I'm afraid to speak to this stranger or speak to this person because I care what they think of me, is to just try and take myself out of the picture and remember why I'm doing this, what it's about, remember God in the picture. And I think that for me often immediately realigns my perspective of where I'm at and what I'm trying to do, and the fact that it's actually God's power in me, and it tends to at least make me step out. It's not necessarily successful stepping out, but the courage thing comes in.
My wife read a book recently called Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, which is a biography. And the only reason I'm recommending that is that she was a member of the sort of wider royal family, very well connected, and she was the one who built the wooden stadiums for Wesley and Whitfield to preach in up and down the United Kingdom. So she bankrolled it, and she also used all of her connections to bring all of her friends to come and hear them, many of whom were not appreciative of the invitations that they received, nor of the message that they heard, and she had to deal, therefore, with all of the social fallout of someone who felt they had a lot to lose. And so that may be, for some of you, that may be an encouraging one to read about how she felt that she, how she worked and how she was faithful to the opportunity that God put before her, even though it came often at times of, a lot of personal ridicule of her, given the standing that she had in society, but the fact that she was so willing to identify herself with Christ. Why don't we take another question?
You talk about things like fear, and to my mind there's this extraordinary thing with things like fear and humiliation and doubt, in that they're the most potent and universal things that any human being in some sense worries about, Christians worry about, and yet we are just paralysed when it comes to sharing them with each other. And I don't know if it's a cultural thing or whatever, but there's this scourge of Christians who have all these things, and yet when you talk to your Christian brothers and sisters about how things are, you just say, oh, it's all okay. And even if your internal understanding of things is falling apart, or you're suffering with pain, illness and things, it's okay. And do you have any, I won't use words like tactics and things, but do you have any words on how you can even begin to break down those fears of being seen to be vulnerable, even with the people who you should be able to be vulnerable with most? And start to be able to encourage each other in the way that you just sharing that you experience fear and things has been encouraging to us now.
I remember when I was 21 and my husband and I were involved in a church plant, and we'd been asked to lead a home group, and we went along to this training, and the vicar said to us, the first thing you need to know about leading a home group is your group will only be as vulnerable as you are. So if you try and lead some kind of meeting and you want people to share openly and honestly, that will only happen if you go there. So I think in my own life, the importance of Christian community and meaningful Christian relationships, I'm not saying I do it all, but that has stayed with me, that, what we put into it, we get out of it. So I know for Michael, I'm sure for Tanya it's true as well, the importance of whether it's a church home group or a prayer triplet or whatever you call it, whatever the language of that group is, but that you are in meaningful Christian relationship, deep relationship, and you choose to make yourself vulnerable. And I wonder whether as you get older, I think as I've got older, that's become harder. I think for those of us involved in Christian ministry in any kind of public way, that's difficult too, because people can use your vulnerabilities against you. So trust is really important. But if we're not prepared to go there in relationship with others, others won't with us. And it's such a beautiful thing when you see that kind of reality in Christian relationships. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, and I wonder as well whether sometimes you pass somebody that you've talked to once in the last 6 months, ask them how they are, and they're like, I'm fine, and actually you then find out that it was all falling apart. And I think there does really need to be a relational context. I think the deeper the relationship, the more trust there is that you really can be vulnerable with one another. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe one thing that's symptomatic of is that we're not in sustained, deep, trusting relationships with each other, and actually that's the root. And in those relationships, then we need to step out and be vulnerable and allow others to do the same. But actually, I'm really fine with not being, my heart on my sleeve with somebody who's talked to me once a year and, here's everything that's happening in my life. So I think it's partly a sense of, are we really building in our churches deep, meaningful, accountable relationships where however awkward it is, we are going to have this conversation and we are going to sit it through and we're going to love one another through, and I'm going to be here next week and the week after and the week after. And that kind of thing, I think, is really vital.
I think it's easy in a postmodern world for people to look at the many different kinds of churches and the Christian church, the different kinds of traditions, and maybe say that as an argument against absolute truth. And so I'm just wondering, in your conversations with people, personal conversations, if you have a helpful way to kind of address that issue of, oh my gosh, there's so many different kinds of churches, Christian churches. How can you say that there's an absolute truth in that?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a story. I think it may have been Ravi who I first heard tell it about a man who was on a desert island, and he'd been stranded there for a long time, and eventually a rescue party arrived, to collect him off the island, and this boat landed, and they came off and they could see 3 huts. And they said, what are those 3 huts for? He goes, well, that one's my home. And they go, okay, well, what's that one? He goes, that's my church. And he goes, okay, well, what's that 3rd one? He goes, oh, that's the church I used to go to. And so I think, we've got an issue here that we really need dealing with. And I will say one thing. There are a lot of other answers that you can give, but while we're here thinking about this as a Christian community, I can remember listening to a guy a couple of years ago called John Woodward, Professor John Woodward. He's been teaching on the history of Christian revival now for over 40 years. So that's been his one subject. And inevitably, after 40 years of teaching on something, year in, year out, and also writing books on it, you reflect very deeply. And I'll never forget him passing. I asked him to write it out for me. I can't. I was looking for it recently. I wasn't able to place my hands on it. But he hand wrote out a quote for me, written by someone who was living in North America during the time of the Second Great Awakening there. And what it was his reflection and then a quote from the secular press. But what this journal article, together with this quote from the secular press, basically said was that before this Great Awakening, everybody knew which church everybody else went to, and everyone spent most of their time complaining and grumbling about the biblical inadequacies of the other churches around them, and their weaknesses and their faults and so on. He says, but when this Great Awakening came and God's Spirit moved on us, we were suddenly so convicted within our own hearts, we realized we had too much stuff to deal with at home to be considered what was happening somewhere else. He said the second thing that then happened was a deep love and genuine affection between those churches, so much so that what the secular press was writing about was how is it that these churches, which would so happily gripe, complain and put each other down just a year ago, now have nothing but praise and honour and whatever for each other. So I think there's something that we need to hear in this question, which is when Jesus talked about, by your love, people will know that you are my disciples. He wasn't actually joking. Now, I've looked at the Greek, I've examined the grammar, and it doesn't matter how sophisticated you meant it. You go into it. He actually meant what he said. There's no other spin you can put on that interpretation. There's just simply no other valid options given to us. So I think that has to ask us a question. To what extent is that true about us? Okay? And it's hard at times. Okay? It's difficult. Okay? But then I don't think love has necessarily ever been easy in that sense. There are times when it is hard. So I think we need that. I think obviously what we do need to explain to people is that although there are lots of different churches, that's not to say that therefore that they all believe very radically different things. If you were to look at, one of the nice things actually of living in this city, if you were to take the large sort of growing churches in this city, this church, St. Ebb's, St. Andrew's, Community Church and so on, you would find a huge harmony in many ways on many of the core things that they teach and believe. So one thing we do need to get across is the fact that we are teaching from the same Bible and we worship the same Christ and the same triune God, and the cross is the centre of all of our message, the centre of our Gospels, and we need to live for Him and so on. We need to be good at doing that. But at the same time, I think we ourselves need to take on board and think to what extent are we part of the solution and to what extent are we part of the problem, and then do some serious repenting and mending offences where they need to be. And so if you're looking for a real spiritual exercise and challenge to take from this place, you could just make a list of all the Christians you find particularly annoying. The ones whom you've pointed out to God, if God were only to call them home early, your life on earth would be so much more pleasurable for the rest of the time He has you here. And make it part of your mission to see if you can actually come into a point of genuine fellowship with them. And even if they've done wrong, it's amazing that love is meant to cover a multitude of sins. But it's not a spiritual discipline we exhort each other to exercise from time to time. But I think it's something that we probably all need challenging on from time. Should we just take one more? Why don't we just take one more question, and then we would actually like to take a time of prayer.
You spoke about the challenges of addressing your colleagues and your family. I work as a mathematician in a university, and I sometimes think it's important that my sceptical colleagues see me as a good scientist in order for my witness to be more powerful. And therefore I often limit myself on what I say to them about my faith. And I wonder if you could speak to the importance of strategy in reaching people, both individuals, maybe you think about a member of your family, or the world. We can stay in step with the Spirit, but to what extent should we use our own mind to develop a strategy to have the biggest possible impact for Christ?
I guess my response would be that with every single person that I evangelize to, unless I'm kind of literally just out on the streets wanting just to keep myself sharp and stepping out and just talking to strangers, that I would be kind of tailor-making that conversation in my response to the person. So if that's what you mean by a strategy, absolutely, that what may work with one member of my family or one friend may well not work with another. And where one person, I just go in and share, this is what I've been reading this morning, and God's amazing, this is what God's done in my life. That might be perfect for one person, and in which case I would just continuously do that and talk to them as though they were one of my Christian friends. Another friend of mine might really just need basic reasoned facts, kind of historicity of the Bible or that kind of conversation, in which case, even with that, I wouldn't necessarily be waiting for them to bring that up. I might be looking for all the time to just throw things out there and see if any of them kind of got their interest and they responded. I guess there might be the strategy as well of this person really does not want me to go any further. I've gone into this conversation so many times and they're clearly very uncomfortable with this, in which case I would probably respect that boundary as well, but that wouldn't mean that I stopped evangelizing to them. My evangelism would then take different forms in terms of loving them. I'd be praying for them in different ways, asking God that they would raise conversations. So I guess I'm saying that there's all sorts of different ways, and if that's what you mean by strategy, absolutely. We don't just kind of one size fits all. That's not how it works. We're addressing real people. So yeah, absolutely.
I think I would want to hold together two paradigms. One is that we need to use apologetics, we need to use the skills God has given us and the position he's put us in to be strategic in our evangelism. So I'll give you an example. I've just moved to where I'm living, and I've met lots of new people through moving into a new area. I've met my neighbours, I've met the people who I might see in shops, and I've basically met the other parents of children. So that is my circle, if you like, of unbelievers that I know. Now, the Christians that I'm in community with, we're praying and we're strategizing and thinking, how can we reach our friends? So a group of us thought, we're going to do two things. We're going to start a book club and invite lots of people we know, and hope to start some meaningful relationship conversation and take conversation evangelism from there. The second thing we thought we'd do is start a Pilates class and offer prayer for people after the Pilates class. Okay, so I'm starting to pray for the different women I've met. I then have random conversations with people, and I'm strategically thinking who I'm going to invite. There are certain people that I've had quite hostile vibes from who know I'm a Christian, partly because Frog has evangelised one of their relatives without me realising, and this woman is quite annoyed about it. She's giving me the really frosty vibes. So I'm not really particularly thinking she might come to my Pilates class. I wasn't even really praying for her. I send round this invitation to all the people that I know, and she is the person who ends up coming to me and saying, thank you so much for inviting me to that class. I can't actually come, but we fall into this incredible conversation and things open up. So I think there's a combination between strategy and the parable of the sower. The sower was the worst sower in the world. He threw seed on the ground, on the path, in the stones, in the thistles. He wasn't really very going like this, right, let's just put it in the soil. He was like, let's throw seed everywhere. So I think we need both in evangelism. We need to be public Christians out there evangelising, in conversation, in relationship, strategically tailoring the things we are inviting people to and taking responsibility for putting things on that our friends might like and that might generate conversation, but also having that kind of scattergun effect and seeing what God does with that. Does that make sense?
That may be a good point. We thought we'd like to take the last 15 minutes of this day, if we could, just to have a brief time of prayer, and maybe to have you praying for each other. Now, I do realise that some of you may not be used to this. Some of you may be here with friends, which is great. That's wonderful. You may have come here on your own. But we were hoping if you could just turn just to 2 or 3 people and just take a few moments just to pray for each other as you go out from this day. We've had an awful lot of things at this day, but since we talked about strategies and so on, we at our 1-year programme just 3-4 days ago, we had an evangelist called J. John come and speak to all of our students. And if you've heard him recently, he very much talks about what he calls pray, care, share. Okay? Which is every day when he wakes up, he prays and says, God, may I take your presence with me, and will you give me an opportunity to share about you today? Care, where he asks God to keep his eyes open about how he might serve other people who are around him and just be aware of what their needs may be. And then share, that he might be able to tell them something about Christ. And obviously, if you ever heard J. John speak, then he has a lot of obviously very humorous and funny stories, of what has happened. And he was telling our students one of the stories. He said he went to a place to buy a coffee and a donut, and every seat was taken in this place. There was only one seat left. And he walked over to where this guy was sitting at a table for two and said, "Excuse me, do you mind if I sit here?" And as he sat down, he just felt that someone prompted that he should say to this guy, "Excuse me, are you married?" And he can remember thinking, "Oh, I don't know if I can do that." And he just thought, "Oh, no, I probably..." And he said, "Excuse me," he said, "do you mind me asking you," while holding up his own marriage ring, just in case this guy thought he was being chatted up. He says, do you mind me asking you?" He said, "Are you married?" And the guy simply looked at him and said, "I can't believe you asked me that." And John said, "Well, why can't you?" He says, "I just can't believe you asked me that." And John's thinking, I might get into trouble now. He says, "I can't believe it." And John said, "Well, why can't you believe it?" He said, "I've been engaged for 5 years. I can't bring myself to set a marriage date. And just this day, my fiancée was on the phone to me saying, 'Look, when are we finally going to get married?'" He says, "And I don't know what to do about it." He says, I don't know whether I can make this step of commitment." And John said, "You are talking to an expert in this." And now one of the questions that the students asked afterwards, which I thought was a very good question, was, "Look, well, you felt prompted that you should do that, but how did you know that was God and not just you thinking that you should do that?" And he simply said, "Well, I like to give God the benefit of the doubt." And, I just thought, well, okay, And I'm wondering if, as we maybe close out this time, maybe we could just have, just maybe twos or possibly threes, just a brief time of prayer. Maybe you could just take it in turns to pray for each other, that there'll be the opportunity to share something, that our eyes would be open to the needs which are around us, which is so important in this day. We're talking about doubt as well, where very often we do need those who will care for us and be for us. And and also that you may take the presence of Christ from this place with you. I'll just say a few remarks just at the very end, and we'll unlock the doors and let you actually escape. So could we do that? Could we just take just literally 5 minutes or so, just find a couple of people. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. If you're not used to it, that is fine. God can even hear prayers that are offered in silence. That's one of the things of being God. Okay, as you just bring those prayers to a close, first of all, I would like to say a big thank you to the students, some of our students who have volunteered their time to serve us, and our staff who are working on a day that normally is a holiday, and just say thank you so much for serving us, for organising, for being there, for handing out. You've done a great job, and we're very, very grateful. Thank you very, very much. So.